The truth is often stranger than fiction, and most times more fun to listen to. Want a good story? Stories about real people. Heroes, villains, survivors, entertainers, and innovators. And some of them are true. Everyone has a story. This is episode number 21, The Bear Business. One of the first television shows I remember watching as a kid was Gentle Ben. The story centered around a young boy with a friendly pet bear. There I was, not even old enough to go to school. I knew about kids with dogs and cats, but this boy had his own bear. How cool was that? The boy's father, played by Dennis Weaver, was a game warden who could speed through the Florida Everglades with the boy and the bear on his airboat. My little mind was delighted by the concept. The whole little boy bear airboat thing captured my imagination. It wasn't until I got older that I learned that bears are inclined to be temperamental. In fact, there wasn't one Gentle Ben. There were three, to improve the likelihood from day to day that they'd have one that would cooperate whenever they were filming. One man who understood the inherent wild nature of bears was John. Born in 1812 in Massachusetts, the second of 7 children, John received little to no formal education. He did train as a shoemaker, a cobbler, starting at 14. But John preferred being outdoors, and by his 20s, he'd grown disillusioned with city life. From an early age, John had a special understanding of the nature of wild animals and their behavior. He longed to explore that unique insight, and the opportunity finally presented itself when he was just 21. John was hired to capture wild animals in nearby Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine for zoological exhibits. Unfortunately, while helping to manage a traveling display of exotic animals shipped from faraway lands, John suffered spinal injuries when he was attacked by a Bengal tiger. It nearly killed him. During a year-long recovery from the severe injuries that kept him bedridden for months, John had lots of time to rethink his course in life. He decided to forget this dangerous thirst for exploring nature and returned to work as an unassuming shoe cobbler. He even got married and started a family there in Massachusetts. Then, in 1849, the California gold rush began. John and his father pooled their life savings of $6,000 to buy a shipment of footwear. They hoped to make their fortune by selling new shoes to the thousands of 49ers as they passed through St. Louis, Missouri on their way to California. But their business venture literally went up in flames when their stock was destroyed in a dock fire in St. Louis. They were financially ruined. Compounding the tragedy, John's father hanged himself. With nothing to lose, the outdoors once again beckoned John until he could no longer hold back. He left for California along with a group of 49ers, promising to send money to his family whenever he could. John settled on 160 acres near Stockton, California, and began to experience some success with a combination of gold mining, trading, and ranching. But once again, John was confronted with misfortune. He was informed that the cattle on his property were stolen and that someone else had a claim to his land. If that wasn't enough, he was being sued by other miners for not sharing his water, and John had to countersue a neighbor for jumping his claim. Taken to court, John lost his temper. He'd had enough and abruptly departed with nothing to show for his efforts except a wagon, a pair of oxen, some clothes and blankets, a Colt revolver and a few rifles, and some cooking utensils. Not much, but it was enough for a man who wanted to get away from it all. He was ready to walk away and just go live in the mountains. John headed into the Sierra Nevada mountains in the summer of 1853. With the help of some friendly local Indians, by autumn, John had built a shelter for himself east of Sonora, California, and was learning to live off the land. He adapted to his new lifestyle by becoming an acute observer of nature and an expert trapper and hunter. He was able to sell skins and meat in the settlements, providing for himself and his Indian neighbors. John also began collecting a variety of live animals at his primitive camp: badgers, wolves, elk, and antelope deer. He was particularly intrigued with California grizzlies. In the winter of 1854, John trapped a monster bear that was weighed on a hay scale at 1,500 pounds. It's still one of the largest grizzly bears ever captured alive. John gave the bear the name Samson. Yes, these were far more substantial creatures than the little black bears he'd encountered back east. John found just how much so in 1855 when he suffered head and neck trauma in a wild grizzly attack. His scalp was dislodged, and John was left with a silver dollar-sized hole punctured in his skull just above his forehead. There were other close calls as well. After 3 years of living in the wild, John moved to San Francisco, where he put on public shows with his menagerie of animals. John, in his buckskin suit, would ride through the streets on his favorite grizzly bears named Lady Washington and Benjamin Franklin, leading audiences to his Mountaineer Museum. They became so popular that newspapers began to write about John and the star animal in his collection, the grizzly bear Benjamin Franklin, that became widely known as Gentle Ben. In 1856, one newspaper reported, "His celebrated bear, Ben Franklin, is a perfect wonder in this way. His keeper mounts and gives him an invitation to shake him off. Bruin stands on 3 legs and rolls like an elephant. But when this method fails, he throws back his paws and claws his rider down. He stands upon his hind legs, and his keeper gives him a gentle shove, and over he goes as if impelled by an irresistible force." Another newspaper in San Francisco referred to John as the Barnum of the Pacific. Little did they know how prophetic the association with P.T. Barnum would soon become. That same year, in 1858, Benjamin Franklin, John's favorite grizzly bear, died. John was devastated. He continued his daily animal shows, but attendance declined while costs for animal feed and wages for his helping staff escalated. A year later, John was so financially overextended that he lost his museum building to creditors. John's own health was deteriorating, and he decided it was time to put his affairs in order. He was keenly aware of the years of estrangement from his family back in Massachusetts, who he had not seen in over a decade. He was anxious to earn enough so he could leave a comfortable sum for his wife and establish her financial security. In 1860, John and his menagerie embarked from San Francisco on a 3.5-month voyage aboard a clipper ship around the Cape Horn and back up to New York City. To raise some operating capital, John sold an interest in his animals to a man who in turn sold the note to P.T. Barnum. John walked into P.T. Barnum's office dressed in his buckskin suit, trimmed with skins and bordered with the hanging tails of small Rocky Mountain animals. Thinking old John was as much of a show as his beasts, John's new partner was thrilled. Barnum quickly engaged his publicity machine to generate flyers and newspaper ads with stories about John's interesting and exciting life. Initially, John teamed up with Barnum to show his bears at the circus, performing for 6 weeks in a canvas tent. John performed his usual feats in which he would play on the circus floor with giant half-ton grizzlies. Ironically, the animals that John trained caused him severe injuries that would ultimately lead to his death. On the day that John had first walked into Barnum's office, he removed his fur cap, exposing a horrific head wound, a memento from his scrap with the wild grizzly 5 years before. Later, while wrestling with another bear during an exhibition back in California, one of John's own trained grizzlies struck him in the head and reopened the wound. He was subsequently re-injured several times, eventually leaving John's brain tissue exposed. His skull was literally broken in, wrote Barnum. The last blow from the bear called General Fremont had laid open his brain so that its workings were plainly visible. The damage was further exacerbated while he was on the circus tour in New England with Barnum after a monkey jumped onto John's head and bit into the wound. The wound refused to heal. John sought the advice of the New York College of Physicians and Surgeons, but they could only tell him what he knew already. The examining doctor reported, when the heart beats, if the head is uncovered, the pulsations can be seen in the boneless portion of his cranium. There was no hope, and John had no illusions about the state of his health. Barnum had already hired his replacement. Nevertheless, John was determined to continue with the show as long as he was able. Barnum offered John $60 a week plus expenses, but he urged John to return home to his family. "What will you give me extra if I can stay with the show for 10 weeks? Barnum was astounded at the request, yet agreed to pay an additional $500 bonus to John's wife if he could finish out the term. She joined John for his final tour. Barnum met them a few times along the way and found John becoming ever weaker. After completing his contract with Barnum, John went home. Only 48 years old, it was a scarred and tired old man who returned to his wife and daughter in Massachusetts. John Capon Adams died 5 days later. Remember that 1,500-pound monster bear John called Samson? You can still see it today on the flag of California. Now, if you're old enough, you may remember the 1970s television series with Dan Haggerty, The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams. It was about a wrongly accused fugitive who lived out in the wilderness with an orphaned grizzly bear cub named Ben. Well, that was loosely based on the real life of John C. Adams. It was Barnum who consistently referred to his associate as Grizzly Adams, and it was Barnum who made the name stick. Well, that's his story. Stories like this and others are meant to be shared. You can pass them along to friends and family, especially your kids. It'll give you something to talk over. The longer you live, the more you realize that grown-ups are kids with experience. I'm Rodney Powell, and you're listening to the Everyone Has a Story podcast, a production of realmedia.us. Add it to your favorites so you don't miss any good episodes. I'm glad we had a little time together. I look forward to having you back. Everyone has a story.